Hi there, Zalatath Industries calling. We've been trying to reach you about your Ascended warranty. Now, according to our records, you ascended on September 19th, so your ascension is complete. What I'd like to talk to you about today is some opportunity for ongoing care through our extended ascension, and they've hung up. What's up, everybody, and welcome back to Sounds Good Makes Sense, a discussion show for the World of Warcraft player. My name is Devilor, and today I want to talk about delves. I'm going to talk a bit about how they just are currently and how delves are playing out currently, plus some of the issues that we saw at the start of the season. Talk about how they're fitting into the overall Endgame package and the overall content that's available at Endgame right now in the War Within. And also discuss a little bit, just general ideas of what are some things that I'd like to see changed? What are some ideas that are worth considering for places for delves to go in the future? Now, before we really start, there's one big point that I want to clarify before we continue, because a lot of the discourse that I've seen surrounding delves right now has sort of floated around this notion that delves are intended specifically and exclusively for casual players or for people that don't want to push challenging content. And I think it's very important to remember that that is patently and categorically false. Like, obviously, more casual players are meant to be a core part of the audience for delves. But when delves were originally announced, they called it a parallel progression track to Mythic Plus and Raiding. They were talking about how Mythic Plus is for like small group content and Raiding is for larger group content. And then they wanted delves to be the solo to even smaller group, similar and ultimately somewhat equivalent progression path to those types of content, meaning that what that directly means is that the intention was that, yeah, the lower difficulties of delves, absolutely fully casual friendly, fully like if you just want to go in and chill out and have a good time going through a delve, that is what those lower difficulties are intended for. But as you increase in difficulty, the stated intention from Blizzard from the beginning has been that those higher tiers of difficulty for delves are meant to be difficult. It's meant to be challenging content. That's meant to be something that the hardcore solo player in World of Warcraft can aspire towards and really dig towards. And in fact, even if you go into the game, you go up to a delve and you select tier 11, if you've been able to make it that far in your progression to where you can actually select it, tier 11 actually says directly on the tooltip in the game. I'll put it on the screen here as well. It says, recommended for adventurers who want an unfathomable challenge. So the game itself is even telling you this is meant to be challenging content at the highest tiers of difficulty. I imagine the concept of delves essentially came about as, remember the Mage Tower? What if we made that an entire content vertical? What if we made it something where there was easy Mage Tower at the start, and then it got progressively more and more and more and more difficult as time went on, so that it was something you could aspire towards and build yourself up towards and earn meaningful rewards from as a result. That idea of a challenging solo content, but that also had that whole tail at the beginning of it that allowed for it to be more accessible to more casual players. Now, again, I want to be clear. It's obvious, yes, that casual players and that the solo player is a core part of the delves intended target audience. But that doesn't mean that those are the only people that it's targeted towards. And like I say, the game itself is directly saying that at the top ends, it's meant to be challenging. So let's quit with the whole like this is only content that's meant to exist for people who don't want a challenge. That is very patently not true, and this is going to be important to keep in mind as we go through some of the stuff I'm going to talk about here in this episode. Now, whether or not that's a good idea, whether or not that's how it should stay, that's all debatable as well. It's very like it is completely valid to say, yeah, maybe they originally wanted this to be super challenging content, but I like it how it is, so let's keep it as something that is purely for casual players. Like that's a perfectly valid opinion to have. That you're all welcome to that opinion. Just please stop saying this. Please stop saying that it is meant to be exclusively for that audience, because that is not what Blizzard said, and that's not even what the game says. And in fact, this was pretty apparent at the launch of the season. Like solo delves were very, very hard. And this led to a lot of the bizarre issues that happened with the rollout of delves when season 1 actually began. So solo delves, trying to do delves by yourself, that was very, very difficult. It was literally harder in multiple different ways, not just from a perspective. It was harder to do delves solo than with a group, not just from perspective of, oh, things are generally easier in a group, but literally it was hard. Like the content was tuned to be more difficult for a single, like it was actually better if you wanted to solo a delve, just because of how the scaling was broken at launch. It was actually better for a lot of classes to zone in and then have someone else zone in with you. And even if they stayed at the entrance to the delve the entire time and didn't do anything, the mobs were literally scaled to be easier to defeat than if there was only one person in there. Basically, the group scaling was horrifically broken. Sloot ended up doing a bunch of testing on this and posted some stuff to Twitter, which incidentally, it all got like retuned almost immediately afterwards. But it was crazy stuff. Like if you were a tank and you went in by yourself, I forget exactly what the difficulty level and everything that he was doing this testing on was, but it was the same difficulty level that he did this comparison with all the time on all of these. And there was a certain mob that he was looking at, and if he went in just by himself as a tank spec, that mob had like 2.5 million health. If he went in just with himself and a DPS in the group, all of a sudden that mob only had 1 million health. Like the scaling was just completely bugged in some way or another, to where being in a group made delves substantially easier, not just by a factor of there are more people there to kill the mobs, but the mobs themselves were weaker if you were in a group than they were if you were in there by themselves. So that was obviously very broken. The other huge bug that was going on at the start of season 1 was that Bran was just scaling ridiculously. Like, I don't know what was actually going on with his scaling in group content, but essentially the more people you had in a group, Bran did exponentially more damage. It wasn't just like, oh, now there's 2 Bran's worth of damage that was occurring. It was like, if you bring in a second person, Bran is now doing 5 times as much damage. If you bring in a third person, he's now doing 20 times as much damage. It was scaling that dramatically, to the extent that when me and Sloot and Spencer were just like, hey, the Dells just launched, let's go in there with our alts to try and see how high we can get. How we wanted to go in with our like monk alts. Essentially, we went in there because we wanted to see how high we could get our delves unlocked to, so that then we could go back on our mains and already have those higher difficulties unlocked, so we didn't have to worry about things like bountiful delves losing the because we weren't quite sure exactly how that system was working at the time. So our plan was go in on our alts, get our warband leveled up in terms of what's accessible to them, and then go in on our mains afterwards and do the higher difficulty delves. What ended up happening was, because there were 3 of us in a group and one was a tank, one was a DPS, and one was a healer, not only were the mobs incredibly easy, but Bran was just going off. Bran was insane, his amount of damage that he was pumping out, to the extent that we just kind of plowed through everything and ended up clearing a tier 11 in the first like 3 hours of delves being open, which again, it was presented to us as an unfathomable challenge. And we were in like item level 560 gear at the time. Like we had no business doing this. It was just super, super bugged. And yes, we did report it. And that's probably part of how it got fixed. It was this thing that we observed and we were like, hang on, this doesn't seem correct. So then we reported it. But anyway, that was how broken delves were at the start of the expansion, or the start of the season, in such a way that the solo delves, where things seemed to be more or less correctly scaled to, like they were very, very difficult, but it seemed in line with what Blizzard had originally stated as the intention. Group delves, going in with a group, made things so ridiculously easy that that was just what everyone started doing, and it became a problem very quickly. After that, like I said, Blizzard made a whole bunch of hot fixes, because obviously they were getting not just our reports, but a ton of people were reporting this stuff that was like, this seems wrong, you should probably fix this. And so the end result where we are now is that delves overall feel like they're in a better state. They're definitely a lot more doable solo, and it is still an advantage to go in with a group just by the sheer virtue of having other people around. But it's not so much an advantage that you feel like you can't do them solo. Like it's still like, it's perfectly, it's now up to you. Do you want to bring other people in or not? That's kind of how it works out. And it's gotten to the point now where pretty much anyone can solo a tier 8 delve, as long as you're playing your class effectively, you're doing pretty well. It's got some challenge to it, but it's not like impossible, and it's not something that you're going to like necessarily struggle at forever, so long as you are a relatively skilled player. And I know that's not everyone, but that's fine. It's how it is. Tier 8 delves are attainable in solo play without it being like as mind-blowingly difficult as it used to be. Now that does mean that people who didn't essentially go into them day one like we did, and just sort of accidentally find our way to having cleared everything super fast, did miss out on that early clear. It's not super problematic to try and catch up to that at this point. So it's not like you missed out forever and now you're behind or anything like that. It was a advantage that evaporated like a couple of days later. It does mean that like it's yet another case though where getting into the thing early meant that there was something weird about it, so you were able to get it done much easier. Now that does often happen in the other direction as well, where sometimes if you try to go in on day one, everything is broken and you can't get anything done. But there have been a lot of cases in the past where essentially this has occurred. There's something that is weird or bugged or broken about the new thing that just came out. That means it's just massively easier right away. And Blizzard can't really just leave it like that. Like, I don't think them saying, oh, whoops, we'll just nerf everything so that delves are super easy for absolutely everyone, and thus they just kind of are a joke throughout the entire season. I don't think that would have been a useful way to try to resolve the problem. I know there were some people who were like, yeah, just make it so that everyone has a really easy time getting to tier 11. And that's not really interesting. And now tier 11, to be clear, tier 11 is now to a point where it is actually a challenge to go in and clear tier 11, which is good to see. I like that. But essentially the issue of some people got this like really early head start that evaporated like 2 days later. That was a lesser problem than leaving the delves in the broken state that they were. What could Blizzard have done to avoid this? Now, I know there's always that sort of case of like, well, we're here now, so hindsight is 2020, but hindsight is still a good thing to look at. Like, what are some lessons to learn from this? What are some things to look back at that I think should have been done, or like at least in hindsight would be good to consider for stuff like this in the future? Clearly there was some sort of gap somewhere in testing. Like the stuff that we discovered going through these, it was the sort of thing that should have been like, we figured out pretty quickly, hey, something is wrong here. And that was when we reported it. I mean, we were going to stop doing delves at that point. Like, we were having fun and we were clearing stuff, and it was, well, obviously we're going to keep doing it, but it's the sort of thing where like, okay, something is obviously bugged here. And we recognized it pretty quickly that was what was going on. I don't remember personally, and I wasn't able to find, looking this up online, how much of the higher tiers of delves were testable in the alpha and beta. I know that for a long time they were locked to just the lower tiers. I don't know if they ever tested the like really difficult delves during beta. And even then, they may have only tested them and really only gotten testing, like beta testing, from solo players, because the solo play experience, like I said, seemed to be pretty much where they wanted it to be in terms of difficulty overall. The problem was just that there was so many bugs with the way it was scaling in groups that it made it laughably easy to do it if you were in a group of any variety. So there needed to be better testing done in terms of, or at least better response to testing, or something somewhere in the testing to development pipeline was broken. I want to put a quick caveat here. People are always very quick to blame the QA testers when something doesn't show up or some bug gets through or whatever. QA testers will test what you tell them to test. So if nobody ever told them to test group content, then it wasn't the QA tester's fault. It was the person whose job it is to tell the testers what to test. And oftentimes that's actually the designers. The designers will put a thing out and they will say, here are the things that I need tested on this to make sure it works. If the designer never put in, make sure the group scaling works the way that I designed it to, then that's on the designer in that case. I don't think it's very useful to really point fingers at anyone in particular in this whole thing. Like, it's anyone's guess. I have no idea personally. Anyone's guess as to where exactly the ball was dropped. And it's very likely that there were several balls that were dropped at several points along the line. Regardless, I'm sure, like, I worked at Blizzard for a long enough time that I am positive that there are discussions being had inside Blizzard in terms of like, okay, how does this not happen again? Why did this go out so bugged like this? And how do we avoid that happening again in the future? Regardless, that is something that needed to have occurred here. But I also think there's at least one other thing that would have been good to do for the rollout of a brand new content vertical like this, which is, I actually don't know why tier 11 delves were available at the start of the season. Like, Mythic Plus wasn't available yet. Higher tier raids, higher difficulty raids weren't available yet. Why was the highest difficulty, if the highest difficulty of the dungeon content vertical and the highest difficulty of the raiding content vertical were not available at season launch, why was the highest difficulty of the delve content vertical, which again is supposed to be a parallel path to the other two, why was the highest difficulty available immediately upon season launch? This would have given the opportunity for at least a little bit more of an opportunity for them to realize, oh, holy crap, people are plowing through these 5s and 6s way faster than they should be able to, as long as they're in a group. Something's broken here. Let's figure out what's going on with that. And they would have been able to recognize and theoretically amend this issue before the like more difficult content had actually rolled out, so that way it wasn't something where it was pulling the rug out from anyone, and it wasn't something that was allowing people to get further progress than they should be able to because of this bug. It's literally the same reason that mythic raids don't come out until after normal raids come out and heroic raids come out. That's why heroic week exists, is so that there's that week, well, it historically exists, is so that there was that week of let's figure out what's going on with the raid, let's figure out what the bugs are, etc. So that if something is just straight up broken, we can then fix it. I actually, as I'm saying this, I'm not remembering off the top of my head if they completely got rid of heroic week with this season launch, or if I misremember. I don't remember exactly. So correct me if I just said something very stupid. I'm not rating this tier, so I haven't been paying super close attention to exactly when each of the raids unlock. I know that the mythic race just started, and it didn't start at the time that the season launch began. So obviously there was a week in there. I just don't remember if heroic difficulty was available during that week. Regardless, we're in this state now where it feels overall easier to complete delves for gears, at least as long as you have keys to complete those bountiful delves and open the coffer key at the end. It feels overall easier to do a tier 8 delve than it does to do the equivalent rewarding content in Mythic Plus. So here's what I mean by that. A tier 8 bountiful delve, which is the highest you can go where the rewards start. That's basically where rewards stop scaling for delves, is tier 8. You can go up to 11, but you don't get anything better for it. That tier 8 delve gives you a piece of 603 gear at the end of that run. That's the same as a +5 key. Now, +5 keys are fairly challenging. They're not like incredibly difficult, but they're at least at the point where you really have to start being mindful of mechanics. You probably want to have consumables. You probably want to have your gear enchanted and gemmed and so on. And you want to understand your build very well, and you want to understand your stat priority, etc. The tier 5 is about or +5 is about the point where that really starts to become a thing for Mythic Plus. At least in my opinion, that's about that point. 2s through 4s, you can kind of do whatever to get through. They're not easy, but they're not like super sweaty. Tier 5 is, or +5 is about where the sweat starts to come in a little bit, and you have to really start thinking about this and understanding your classes a little bit better. You have to start making sure you understand boss mechanics, because your healer's not going to be able to heal you through them anymore. You can't just stand in things and hope that your healer just keeps you alive. You do actually have to react to stuff that's going on, because otherwise you just die, and there's nothing your healer can do about it. Hi, it's me. I'm the healer. Please stop standing in things. So that's at a tier 8 bountiful delve. That's roughly equal. The end of run reward is roughly equal to the end of run rewards that you can get from +5 key. That 616, talking about the Great Vault, the 616 you can get for that tier 8 bountiful delve that goes into your Great Vault. That you don't get in Mythic Plus until you do a +7 key. And I've been doing +7 keys. They are tricky, they are challenging, and they can be kind of a slog. Like there's still the sort of thing you could absolutely eventually get through, even if you're a group that's struggling a little bit. Like I would be surprised if I was in a group that just could not complete a +7 key unless we were like all massively undergeared or something like that. But it still is the sort of thing where that, like in that sort of situation where you're undergeared or you're just not playing very well, that could take you hours to get through that +7 key. And you're not going to time it at that point, at the very least. So the +7 key, to me, at least in my opinion, a +7 key is significantly more difficult than completing a tier 8 delve. But the Great Vault reward is the same, where you get those 616s in your Great Vault as a result. Now, obviously, you do need to have keys to do bountiful delves. You can't just farm them forever. So when it comes to Mythic Plus, you can just continue to do keys. You can continue to do Mythic Plus keys over and over and over again, and you can farm those 603s and higher much more easily than you can doing delves, where there's only 4 bountiful delves up every day, and you do need to have those coffer keys to be able to open them to get those rewards out of them in the first place. Otherwise, you're basically farming for, it's like 593 or something like that you can hope for as a drop at the end, and that's not really anything too exciting. That does mean that Mythic Plus is basically just something that you do when you don't have any keys. Like it's not really, when you don't have any coffer keys, that is. It's not really a parallel path so much as delves are the thing that kind of everyone should be doing right away. If you have the ability to do a bountiful delve, if you have a coffer key, you should go do that. And then you should go and do whatever other content you want to do. So it's almost turned delves into this like pre-step. And that has the issue of it being something where like, like they're so easy to get into, and it's such a like personal thing that it feels dumb to not do it. Like it feels wrong to be like, I would like to do Mythic Plus and I'm not going to do delves at all because I don't feel like it, but I'm going to be pushing these higher keys. Like, no, that feels stupid. That is straight up a mistake and an incorrect choice to make at this point because of how the reward structure is built out. And I think that's where a lot of the concern about the rewards that are coming from delves and the relative difficulty is coming from. Is a lot of that is coming from people who just want to do Mythic Plus. They want to be like me, for example. I love running Mythic Plus. I would love to do nothing but Mythic Plus all the time when I log in. I feel like I need to go and do these delves first because it's just such a good source of loot and it's so easy by comparison that I feel like it'd be dumb of me to not. So I think that's part of the friction that's now coming in, is from people who don't necessarily want to do delves. It's not necessarily the content that they're focused on. It's not necessarily the content that they want to spend their time in, but it just feels mandatory in the sense that why would you not do this? It's so straightforward and easy. Now, once you start getting into the higher level keys in Mythic Plus, you start getting hero gear as your drops, and that is definitely much more available through Mythic Plus than it is through delves. You will never get hero track gear from the end of run rewards in a Mythic Plus. It will only ever, or sorry, in a delve, it will only ever come from the higher keys in Mythic Plus, which does mean that probably as we start to get later in the season and people start focusing more on the like 7s through 10s keys, we start getting more and more people that are focused on those higher level keys. That area where it starts, I think it might be plus, I think it is +7 where the hero gear starts dropping. I don't remember exactly off the top of my head. But once we start getting to the point where that's the primary focus for most Mythic Plus groups, I think we'll start seeing less of a concern from that audience towards delves, kind of this mid-season period of time. We'll start seeing the Mythic Plus audience a little bit less worried about doing their delves constantly because they're getting that Great Vault reward anyway. They might still do one or two of them, 1 to 4 of them, I should say, just for the Great Vault, just to knock that out. But that's 4 of them. That's whatever. That's not that big of a deal. I think we'll start to see a lot, and even then, like they're going to get better Great Vault rewards out of the higher level keys that they're running in Mythic Plus anyway. And they're not getting that hero track gear from the delves. So if they want to be upgrading that gear to higher item levels, you do need to have that hero track. Obviously, eventually you want the Mythic track, but that only comes from Mythic Rating. I believe that only comes from Mythic Rating. I don't remember this whole system. I'm going to make a video about the upgrade system at some point because it's so friggin' overcomplicated that I cannot keep track of all of it. And I've been playing this game for 20 years. Like I really hate the upgrade system. The end of Dragonflight into War Within item upgrade system. It's so needlessly complicated. It drives me crazy. That's a separate topic though. That's just me explaining why I keep getting mixed up in my own head trying to explain this stuff because it's too complicated. Anyway, talking about the mid-season, it's entirely possible that the Mythic Plus audience no longer cares about delves once we get to the mid-season. But in the same token, it's also very possible that the delve audience no longer cares about delves once we get to the mid-season, because once you've gotten to that point, you're full up on your 603 gear and you've been upgrading it. It's your champion gear. You've been upgrading it all the day, 8 out of 8. You are still getting your 1 Great Vault piece of hero gear per week. And that's still something that you will want to get. But there's eventually going to be a point where, like 8 weeks in, maybe you already have all of that you're really that worried about. There's how many item slots? Maybe eventually you reach a point where it's just not worth the extra effort for this player who is not wanting to put that much effort into it anyway. They might eventually reach a point where the same sort of issue starts to occur for players who are primarily interested in delves. I don't know. We'll see how things continue to shake out. And a lot of it will just depend on what additional adjustments Blizzard decides to make to things as time goes on, because I am hoping there will be some adjustments made. These are just sort of thoughts that I am having about the system as it exists currently. And on the topic of adjustments, it's very likely that part of the problem here is that Mythic Plus has actually ended up being slightly overtuned for what players want out of it. Obviously, they did this whole key squish thing. I don't know if that's actually the term that they use for it, but this whole thing where what used to be a +10 is now basically a Mythic 0. And then now if you're doing a +2 key, you're essentially doing a +11 key as it existed previously in Shadowlands and so on. And it's +11, not +12 with the +2, because there's no such thing as a +1 dungeon. I don't know why we call them Mythic 0s and not Mythic 1s. That's actually a little bit weird, but whatever. That's a whole nother topic. So this key squish has occurred where now essentially like these +5 keys I was talking about earlier are actually at the point where you really start having to pay attention. Whereas it used to be the case that you could just live in, like, if you were just looking for keys to just farm, you could just live in that like 4 to 7 area and just farm keys constantly. Like, I used to do this with alts a lot, where I would level up a character. I would go to every like 4 through 8 key that I could find. Essentially, I didn't go into the 9s because I didn't want to deal with that extra affix, because this was an alt and I was just trying to do something simple and quick and easy just to farm. Essentially, it was good mindless farming for me. Go into as many 4 to 8 groups as I could find, and as soon as the gear stopped being useful from those runs, as soon as I no longer needed anything from any of these dungeons on that character, I would start another alt and I would start working on them and doing the same thing, just because I found running the dungeons fun. It was literally just fun for me. It wasn't something that I was doing because of efficiency or anything like that. It was just something that I would just, yeah, it's cool. I'll just plow through a whole bunch of 4 through 8s and it'll just be kind of fun for me. That's not really a thing anymore. Chill Mythic Plus isn't really a thing anymore. I have heard some people expressing the theory that, and I think Blizzard might have even said this at some point. I don't know. This was during the time period where I was not really playing when this originally occurred. But the theory being that, like, okay, the 2 through 9 keys had essentially become this just kind of wasteland where you just wanted to get to a +10, and +10 was then where Mythic Plus actually started, and then you could go up from there. And that was like the real Mythic Plus game. So the point of the key squish then was to just cut that out of there and let everybody start at that bottom point. And part of the reason for that, at least from what I've seen, is that what I've seen people saying, at least, is that a lot of those lower keys just ended up being full of like toxic players who were there because their approach to I can't complete higher content was blame everyone but themselves, when they actually had things to learn. That's unfortunately common in video games. There's the sort of person who the reason they're not good at things is because they want to blame everyone else. So that's how you end up with this, like, the lower skilled bracket ends up being one of the more toxic brackets because everyone's pointing fingers at everyone else half the time. That's not everyone in those brackets, just to be clear. That's not what I'm saying. But one of the reasons someone might be in that bracket of difficulty is because they are that sort of person. It's just one of the explanations of how they might get there. So the idea was, let's do this key squish so that now that bracket just doesn't exist. If you are going to be that person, just don't do Mythic Plus at all. You should be in like heroics or something instead at that point. I personally, I'm of the opinion, like, they find a way to just get rid of that person. I don't want to play with them, but it's not really a realistic result. But anyway, the result has now become that this chill Mythic Plus thing is not really a thing. And honestly, the lower level keys are still pretty toxic. I was in a +2 Necrotic Wake where everyone it was on the third boss, on the third boss in Necrotic Wake. The plague, I can never remember his name, the golem guy, the professor dude, whatever his name is. And you know how when those golems die, they leave those like puddles on the ground that you really shouldn't stand in or else you'll die? Well, I was in a +2 Necrotic Wake because I was like, this just sounds fun. I'll just do this. It'll be cheesy and easy and we'll just sail right through this. And half the group was just standing in that stuff. And I was like, this does so much that they've actually hotfixed to nerf the amount of damage it does, because on the lower level keys, even, you could not stand in that without dying. And I'm like, I'm playing a Resto Shaman. I'm probably the most broken, overpowered healer that exists right now. And I'm just standing there spamming heals and cannot keep people up. And then they started going, healer, when are you going to heal us? And stuff like that. And I left the group because I didn't want to deal with it. They can, if they want to be toxic about it, they can deal with their need to find a new healer. But that still exists. It's essentially the point of this story, is to say that that sort of toxic player still exists. And it's still the sort of person that's going to, like, that bracket will, that lower level, that lower skill bracket where people are toxic because the reason they're in the lower skill bracket is they want to blame anyone but themselves for failure. That will always exist in some capacity. Anyway, this was a whole random side tangent that I didn't even mean to go down. But the point of where I was starting with all this was just to talk about the Mythic Plus key squish has now put us in a state where these +5s are actually difficult. +7s, +8s, you really got to be on your game to be able to complete those. It's not the most difficult content that's ever existed, but it's certainly at the point where a mistake can cause you to die, and too many of those such things can cause you to fail the run. So we're still in that sort of state. But because of all of the changes that occurred to delves at the start of the season, delves track for difficulty is ultimately lower than the Mythic Plus tracked for difficulty. But I don't necessarily know that that means that delves are too easy. I think part of that might be that where they've ended up with Mythic Plus difficulty, they may have ended up aiming slightly too high with the overall difficulty. That was the very long-winded point. I apologize for that ramble. That was the very long-winded point that I was trying to get to with all of that. Is I don't necessarily think that delves are the difficulty curve mistake right now. I actually think Mythic Plus might be a little bit overtuned just in general, especially as you start getting to those higher keys. Again, not because I find it to be this dramatically difficult content, but because I feel like the curve might be a little bit too steep for the average player. And when I say average player there, just to clarify, I'm not talking about like the literal center of the line World of Warcraft player. I'm talking about the average person who wants to dedicate their time to progressing through Mythic Plus. I feel like the curve on the difficulty is a little bit there. There are those, especially as you start getting into like Tyrannical and so on. There are these really steep, sharp upticks in difficulty, and I think it might be a little bit too much right now. And it would be nice to have a slightly smoother difficulty curve. Still get to that difficult end. Still get there. I'm not saying make Mythic Plus overall easier. I'm just saying maybe smooth that curve out a little bit. And like I mentioned at some point, I don't know, that was a heck of a ramble just a minute ago. I tried not to listen. I kind of blacked out and now we're here. But like I was saying, I think they've already done a little bit of some targeted tuning here and there. They did a little bit of nerf to those poison pools on the third boss in Necrotic Wake. They did a slight nerf to the end boss in City of Threads, which was honestly the only other boss that I've really struggled with. I've heard a lot of people talking about the Stone Vault, the double boss of the speakers boss in Stone Vault as being extra difficult. And people were like, I don't think you've even played these dungeons. The speakers boss is difficult. And I even said that I thought that one might be a difficult one in the video. Anyway, it doesn't matter. People don't pay attention. It's fine. I've heard some people talking about that one. I think the issue with the Stone Vault boss is more that there is just a chance that the second time they use their abilities, they overlap. So there's just no place to stand. And that just feels like a bug that hopefully they will fix. I don't think that's necessarily a difficulty concern because I don't think that's something that's intended to happen. I think that when I think of difficulty, I think of the concept of how much of a challenge are we presenting to the player intentionally. When something is unintended, that to me doesn't feel like a difficulty problem so much as this is a bug that needs to be fixed. And yes, it still overall contributes to difficulty, but whatever. We're getting into semantics at that point. But I do think I would like to see some more targeted tuning. I would like to see them fix that interaction on the speakers in Stone Vault. And there's probably a few other like specific things. I don't think there needs to be a blanket nerf necessarily. At least I don't think I would want to see a blanket nerf yet. I was just talking about the difficulty curve, but I would like to see things play out a little bit more before I really firmly like settle on that as an opinion. It's just something that I'm kind of thinking about right now. I would like to see more of those like targeted fixes in specific cases where like, yeah, heck, this boss is just too hard in this specific situation, or this specific thing that is occurring is too difficult compared to everything else that you're having to deal with in this band of difficulty. Because again, it's all a curve. It's all a like playing field of what should be relatively even challenges. And so when one thing is just way more difficult than everything else at that tier, that's what we call an outlier. And that's the sort of thing that I would like to see them continue to rein in as necessary. A couple other ideas that I think are worth considering for delves at the very least. One is I think it would be interesting to allow like low level delves to very slowly build up towards even better gear than what actually drops in them. I think there's an opportunity for delves to have that extra appeal to that more casual player who they don't want to get into group content at all. They don't want to get into this like higher difficulty. They're not looking for a challenge. They're just looking for a grind. They're looking for something to continue to focus their efforts on with whatever efforts they happen to have available. You're not going to convince that player that what they should do after completing their tier 4 delve is move on to a tier 5 delve. You're just not going to convince them that doing harder content is the path forward for them. These are just people who want to spend the time and get rewarded for it. So rather than trying to increase difficulty, increase the time it takes to earn those rewards. Give them the ability to eventually work towards this, like, 603, 609, 616, etc. Get them the ability to eventually work towards those pieces of gear, but just make it take a lot longer so that it's not something that the sweaty min-max player feels the need to immediately start working on this, because they're going to have that stuff long before then regardless. So it's a similar concept to like the renown rewards, where most people that are super sweaty about the game, by the time they got to unlocking the purchasable pieces of gear for renown, they were well past the need for that, at least on their mains. It's more of an alt thing, a warbound thing at that point, but they were well past the point where they even needed that gear. Allow that to be the same sort of experience for lower level delves. Allow them to continue to work up. And again, part of this comes back to this complicated and convoluted upgrade system that I really dislike. I'm going to do a video about it at some point, because my God, it drives me crazy. But maybe that's an idea. Give some sort of method for those. So like, it could be something where maybe you let somebody who's doing a lot of delves, after X amount of delves they completed, or after X amount of time, now they can work their way up to getting a token that will upgrade like a piece of veteran gear to champion or whatever it is. Like allow them to upgrade their gear, bump it up to the next track or something like that. I don't know. There's a lot of different ways that could be approached, but the concept of, rather than asking them to do increased difficulty for rewards, replace difficulty with time, allow that to be like, okay, you will not get it as fast as other people, but you can eventually work towards something. Because ultimately what's going to happen otherwise is the person who just likes to do tier 3, tier 4 delves and doesn't want to go any higher in difficulty, they're just going to get bored and stop playing the game. They're going to lose that sort of drip feed of progression that they're getting for their character. And it's an MMORPG. The whole point of the game, the whole purpose of an enjoyment of the game is centered around progressing your character. If you don't allow that sort of person a path to continue upgrading their character, and know that them going to a higher difficulty is not an option, they're just going to stop playing. Now, on the difficulty side of delves, for the player who does really want to dedicate themselves to doing like seriously difficult solo challenging content, solo or small group challenging content, maybe something to consider is let delves scale up to 15 or 20. You could even consider putting hero gear in there at that point, where now you have the ability to go back to like all of that difficulty that was lost from the lower levels of delves because of all the hot fixes and changes that had to occur at the start of the season. Add a few more tiers, put that difficulty back up there, allow that to be super difficult towards the end. Heck, there's even some theories to be had about the potential possibility of like a slow seasonal difficulty ramp, where like every couple of weeks a new tier of something opens up, so that there's always that like next new challenge to look forward to, with greater rewards as a result, obviously, but like keeping the treadmill going for longer. I don't know. I'm not convinced of that concept myself. There's a lot that I would have to sit and really think about in terms of like what the knock-on effects of that would be. So that, consider that a completely half-baked idea. But there's some concepts to consider in terms of like a slow ramp over time. Like this sort of thing could apply to Mythic Plus as well. Open up higher levels of keys as the season goes on, so that by the time you're farming the crap out of the maximum difficulty that's available, you at least have something new to look forward to, that you can take what you've been earning and apply it towards, instead of just having it essentially be, let's make sure that I have the best possible gear for when the next season comes out. But anyway, that has been an awful lot of rambling, just completely off the top of my head nonsense over the last, I don't even know how long at this point. What I do know is that I've left myself a lot of editing work to do in the future. So here's an apology from my past self to my future self for how much nonsense that just was. But what I'm going to do now is I'm going to move on to some questions. We got a couple of great questions that came in, a couple of really interesting ones that I'm excited to talk about as well. The first one is from Uzile on YouTube, who said, I'm seeing some pushback to the loot that delves drop, specifically that it is too high. People who do heroics are crying that delve gear is too high and or they're not difficult enough. Firstly, they can get heroic and mythic loot so much faster than I can. Secondly, I don't think delves were made for the sweaty try-hard players. I think they were made for the casual players who this is the only content beyond questing they'll probably do. We were players who would do the questing when an X-Pack would drop and then unsub and disappear because LFR/LFG wasn't our jam. Now, we're really engaged and having a great time. Thoughts? So a lot of what this question brings up is stuff that I've already discussed throughout the episode. So I'm not going to rehash too much of that. I've rambled about all of that enough already as it is. So things like delves weren't made for try-hard players. Lower level delves weren't, but it was definitely something that was intended to eventually reach a point where there is an actual serious difficulty to it and something to aspire towards. That is very clearly was the intended way that the system was supposed to work. Now, whether or not you want that to be the case is still a completely valid opinion to have. If you don't want delves to be that sort of thing, that is fine. That is a perfectly valid opinion. It's just important to remember that that was not what Blizzard set out to do. So if that's what delves have ended up being, that was unintentional. I just want to make sure that that is clear and understood, that Blizzard's intention with this was that the higher difficulties of delves were actually seriously difficult. But I don't disagree with a lot of what Uzziel is saying here, just to be clear. Part of the reason that I brought up this question is because they raised some very, very good points. Obviously, there is a large number of players, and maybe not obviously. I don't know how many people really realize this, but for a long time in Warcraft history, in World of Warcraft history, maybe still the case, I don't know. But for a long time in World of Warcraft history, there was a sizable amount of the player base, and sometimes greater than 50% of the player base, who would play whatever new content drop came out, go through the questing, and then stop playing because they had no interest in group-based content. That is very clearly the audience that delves are intended for, is the sort of player who once new content comes out, they want to do that new content, and then they don't really care about going into the raids. They don't really care about the new dungeons. And they don't really care about anything that requires grouping up with other players. They just want to essentially play a single player MMORPG, which I know a lot of purists are going to be really angry about the concept of that, but welcome to 2024. It's a genre and it's a very popular one. Look at Final Fantasy 14. That's basically a single player MMORPG with some group content that you can get into if you feel like it. Delves are meant to appeal to that sort of player who they enjoy the grind of increasing their character. They enjoy the MMORPG progression path. They just don't necessarily want to do the parts of the grind that require them to group up with other players. So it's important, and I'm really happy to see delves being explored and produced because, as Uzziel themselves has said here, it's something that is definitely appealing to that sort of player. I think that the part of the issues that essentially Blizzard needs to work through here is how do they continue to support that player without pushing the players that don't want that content into it, right? If you are previously a player who purely enjoyed the group content at Endgame and you're now being pushed into solo content, that is every bit as much a problem as the solo player feeling like they're being pushed into group content. The goal should be, and to be clear, I don't mind it leaning a little bit more towards in favor of the solo player for a period of time because they need to make sure that thing works and then they can balance things out. But it is important to reach that balance. It is important to get to the point where if you just want to be doing group content and your idea of endgame, like maybe like me, I like playing healers. Doing healer content solo is kind of boring and painful. Like, this is why earlier I was talking about how the tier 8 delves aren't that difficult. It's because they're not. I'm playing a resto shaman. I can literally just stand in most things and heal myself through it. And it's whatever. Even on tier 8, like obviously there are the like cone attacks and stuff that you need to dodge still. But for most things, I just sort of heal myself through it and hope that Bran eventually kills whatever it is that needs dying. And that's just kind of how it works. It's not the most exciting content that I've ever done, but it's certainly the most efficient way for me to get through it as a resto shaman. So that's just what I've been doing. I don't enjoy my group role being pushed into solo content like that. It's just not as fun for me personally. But that's not to say that that's not fun for someone else, right? So it's important to remember that in an MMORPG, there are a lot of different perspectives and different ways to look at things. I'm kind of rambling here again, but I do think it was important to bring up this question to just say, yes, this audience exists and they should have content that is catered towards them. I don't think the intention from Blizzard here was to create something that is only ever for casuals and that no one can ever get hardcore about. There's definitely intended to be difficulty at the higher end of delves and figuring out that progression path and what the reward structure for it is supposed to be and so on. That's very important. It's also part of why I kind of like the idea of coming up with some system to replace difficulty with time, whereas someone who's able to tackle the more difficult content will get more of this loot and they will get it faster. But someone who is just wanting to grind and grind and grind can still aspire to eventually getting at least some pieces of pretty good gear as a result. They're at least earning something for their effort and not reaching that point so early on where, okay, I've gotten all of the 590 pieces that I need. I'm not going to just straight up not going to do the content that gets me 593 pieces. So I guess I'm done with the video game now. Like that player kind of is pushed into that position. So interesting perspectives and interesting stuff to consider. Like I said, a lot of what came up in this question was stuff that I was talking about throughout the episode, so I'm not going to rehash all of that. But hopefully that little bit of extra that I was able to provide and answer that question, hopefully that helps a little bit. And this was a very lengthy question as well. I did have to trim it down a little bit, but hopefully that at least gets to the gist of what you're asking about. Anyway, moving on to the next and final question for the day. This comes from Dead and Cold on YouTube, who says, health and damage numbers in WoW are already in the millions, and the first season just started. It's kind of crazy imagining what it's going to look like going into midnight. In your opinion, why is Blizzard waiting to do an item level reset instead of doing it at the start of the War Within? So I can definitely understand and agree with a lot of the perspective here, especially coming off of playing SOD, not really playing Dragonflight much, and playing a lot of SOD and Classic. Going into the War Within, where like in Classic hitting something for like 5k was, oh my god, what a big hit. But now going into the War Within, hitting something for 5 million is actually kind of a big deal. It's such a huge difference in terms of numbers. Especially like looking at player health numbers, it took me a little bit of like rewrapping my brain around how are these numbers actually working. So I totally understand the desire for an additional stat squish to occur. Now, there's a couple of questions to ask here. Things to think about with this as a follow-up. I can't directly answer why Blizzard has not done a stat squish. I can't even directly answer if they're going to do a stat squish. That's actually the first thing that I would consider with this. Do we think that Blizzard is going to want to do another stat squish within the next 3 expansions? The War Within, Midnight, and then The Last Titan. It's possible that they just decide, know what, it's fine. We're going to have players with 12 billion health by the end of this, and we'll just deal with that. We'll just have these crazy, ridiculous numbers that we'll just start using external notation for or whatever. Maybe that's something. Maybe they end up going the mega damage route. Like you remember back when they were first talking about the stat squish, there was that you hit for 12,000 mega damage. Like maybe that's something that actually ends up happening. They just start putting K's and M's and B's and T's on everything so that we can just shorten down what the actual numbers are so that it's a little bit easier for the standard brain to process in a hurry. Maybe that's the approach that they want to do here. The other thought that I had about this is I understand the perspective because obviously the next 3 expansions, we know what they are, and there's sort of this narrative trilogy of the War Within going into Midnight, going into The Last Titan, and it's meant to be like a thread, a story narrative thread through all 3 of those. But it should be noted that because it's a story / narrative thread does not necessarily inherently mean that it has to be a same gameplay through all 3 expansions as well. In fact, I would very much hope that they don't do that because they've built all 3 of these as expansions, right? These are still full standalone expansions with their own, like, well, standalone is the wrong word, but these are full expansions like you've had expansions in the past with their own like patch structure to them, their own tiers and everything that's going to happen and incur throughout all of these. This isn't a like kind of like how BFA had like their content patches or Shadowlands or whatever. Dragonflight even. It's not the Midnight is not a content patch for the War Within is the point that I'm attempting to meander towards right now. This is still a full standalone expansion. So there's not really any particular direct reason why they couldn't do a stat squish in Midnight or they couldn't do a stat squish in The Last Titan if that's what they decided to do. These are standalone expansions that we should expect things like it's fully reasonable to expect new allied races. Hell, maybe even new classes could come along or new specs. Definitely, I think new hero talents would be a great thing to expect to have in all of these things and all of these expansions because they're full standalone expansions that should be treated as any other expansion would have. It's just the narrative thread that ties the 3 of them together. So just because they haven't done one in the War Within doesn't mean that they can't do one in Midnight. I would expect that the gameplay team and the narrative team to, like, just because the narrative team is doing this trilogy doesn't mean that the gameplay team has to, like, say, oh, well, I guess we can't do any major changes to our game until this narrative is done. They can still absolutely totally do that. That's the sort of thing that occurred constantly. Like, remember, essentially Mists of Pandaria through, God, BFA in a lot of ways was all tied together in some in fact, all the way up into Shadowlands even was all tied together through one, like, narrative beat going into the next, going into the next narrative beat, going into the next narrative beat, and so on. This was all stuff that there was a narrative thread that was going through all of that. It's a little bit more direct with the War Within, into Midnight, into the Last Titan, but it's not something that they can't do. They just can't do things like that as a result of it. So it does seem like the numbers are a bit high right now. I would like to see a stat squish in retail at some point, but that may just be because I'm coming off of playing Classic where all the numbers were much, much smaller, and it's just a bit jarring to me at the moment. I could be wrong about that. I am willing to accept that maybe that opinion is not the correct one. Anyway, I'm going to wrap this up. I have rambled so much that I'm losing my voice, which is a very unusual thing for me because I talk so much all of the time. But I'm going to wrap this up. Thank you so much for watching. Reminder, if you would like to ask a question for the show, all you got to do, leave a YouTube comment, and I will do my best to get to it. Or if you're a patron, first of all, if you haven't checked out my Patreon, you can go to patreon.com/devilor, check it out over there. And if you are a patron, patrons get first crack at having their questions answered. So check the listing for this episode. You'll see a link to a form in there that you can fill out, and that will get you priority access to have your question answered here on the show. Thanks again to all of my patrons, by the way. You guys are wonderful, and you keep the content flowing, even if sometimes the flow is a little more like a whitewater rapids of just nonsense coming out of my brain. That's just how we roll around here. I got that. I don't know what I've got. I've got something. I've got to get out of here. I've got to stop talking now. I think that's what I've got. Thanks again, everybody. I'll see you later.